This conference will now be recorded.
Hi, and welcome to Stamp Chat. Thanks for joining us. My name's Heidi Rhodes, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you our presenter, Mr. Leon Reed. Mr. Leon Reed is an APS member, a historian, and the author of the book, No Greater Calamity for the Country. Mr. Reed resides in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and has appeared on previous Stamp Chats, sharing his passion and knowledge of the Civil War as depicted through postal history. Today's Stamp Chat is sponsored by the APS Expertising Department. Founded in 1903, it remains a relevant service we offer members and non-members alike. If you have stamps or covers in your collection that you want to learn more about, the American Philatelic Expertising Service has the answer. Submit a few items from your collection and Apex will confirm their identity and their authenticity. We are the only authority that offers a complete guarantee. Visit stamps.org for more information. And with that, Mr. Reed, let's get on with our future presentation.
Okay. First of all, I wanted to thank Heidi for a tremendous amount of tech support today. We were having some glitches on our dry run, and she truly went over and above, helping make sure we could have this presentation tonight. Tonight, I'm going to take a break from talking about the, what used to be considered the important people, the generals and the senators. And I'm going to talk about culture and the home front. Of the presentations I've done, I think this one may more clearly than any other one demonstrate the point I've made that the patriotic covers are not just collectibles, but also really important historical documents. Tonight I'm going to talk about, I think, 5 different aspects of culture and the home front. Not for any sense of these are the most important reasons, but literally that these were the topics where there was a rich array of patriotic covers on the topic. But I do believe that I hope when I finish, people will agree that simply through a study of the covers, we learn a lot about what the people were thinking. This is, of course, based on my thesis that you're not going to see covers that aren't selling. You're not going to see a second cover on a topic if the first one didn't sell well. So it may not be a gauge of public support, but it is at least inexact, somewhat a gauge of public interest. With that, each of the topics, I'll give a little brief introduction of the theme and then go through the covers. This is really History 101, but the North and the South were very different economies. The South strictly built its economy around plantation agriculture from day one, from the importation of tobacco into Jamestown more than 400 years ago. The North, both for weather and geography, plantation agriculture just wasn't going to work. And so they developed much more diverse economy. This created enormous political differences. The North was much more interested in roads, canals. The South, as long as they had rivers for ships to come up and unload the tobacco and cotton, what did they need roads for? 2 inventions, both by Northerners, the cotton gin and the mechanical loom, in the early 19th century, had an enormous impact on the national economy, but particularly the South. It took cotton from being a really expensive product to just dirt cheap and made it practical to produce it in massive quantities. This loomed very large as the war came on. Cotton was practically the only export crop of the United States, certainly the dominant one. The South thought it was a real strategic weapon for them because they felt that the cotton mills in England and France would grind to a halt if cotton exports were cut off. Pretty much in everything else, the North had a huge advantage in anything related to making war. I'll skip that. So the covers, this is sort of a northern rejoinder to the common southern refrain, cotton is king, pointing out that corn is king. Basically, the argument being, you can't eat cotton. And if you can't export it, what good does it do you? Which a little bit did turn out to be true. It's kind of a support for the point that, hey, we're the ones with a strong economy. What are you going to do about that? A lot of covers, like the one of the Smithsonian that celebrated like important national institutions. I believe the point they were making was, look at us with our superior refined culture. Aren't we a country to be proud of? The one on the top right, of course, the results of Uncle Sam's, benign goodness, peace and plenty. This one, it's a little, at first glance, it seems to be another celebration of northern industry and agriculture, but then you read the caption on it, and it's just the process of making rope so we can hang those traitors. So a little double entendre in that one. Religion was a big topic. It's a very religious age. The Second Great Awakening was still echoing around the country. There had been an enormous increase in church going. The First Great Awakening had sort of cannibalized people from one religion to another. The second one really went after people who were not going to church and made them religious. The revivalist denominations like the Methodist and Baptist grew incredibly. New denominations like the Normans, the Disciples, Adventists. Really the highlight in our country, the high tide in our country of communal societies. If you read speeches, they frequently mention providence. There was a real strong belief in providence, which is God's will at work, that literally, he influences the deeds of men. Most Protestant the Baptists, the Methodists, Lutherans, either just before the Civil War or during had a North-South schism. You get the Southern Baptists and the American Baptists, etc. Revival, both armies were extremely religious. There were revivals and baptisms common in both sides. The U.S. Christian Commission was particularly active in the North. Religion in the South, the Confederate States of America, unlike the United States, was explicitly founded on Christian principles. These are a contrast of the two preambles. You can clearly see the preamble as the whole Constitution is modeled on the United States, but they include invoking the favor and guidance of Almighty God. Providence, in a way, worked against the South toward the end, because as the handwriting was increasingly evident on the wall, as the tide turned, a lot of historians believe that a lot of people kind of lost their faith. God must have turned against us for some reason. An interesting thing about the cover citing religion, one thing we can say is the people knew their Bible. Most of these covers, you'll see they don't quote the verse, they just cite the number of the verse, and it's assumed people know what we're talking about. Interestingly, I've only found one cover that quoted a New Testament verse. This is real Old Testament stuff. Some of it is messages of hope. The cover is slightly paraphrased, but clearly a reference to Psalms 30, verse 5. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning. Genesis, a little bit of, buck me up for Abraham Lincoln. God's covenant with Abraham, fear not, Abram, I am thy shield and thy exceeding great reward. I love the artwork on some of these. Here's one where it just says Daniel 11:25. And I'm sure they assume, they were also very good without Google, at finding the references to the South, rebellion, all of that stuff. stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. The king of the south, but he shall not stand. Isaiah, but if ye refuse and rebel, you shall be devoured with the sword. You can see why these would be attractive to northern audiences early in the war when the casualty lists haven't become a matter of dread every day, and there's still a lot of sort of go team go enthusiasm. Ezekiel 3:9, I have made adamant harder than flint, have I made your forehead. Fear them not. This would be a good one for mom to send her son. Neither be dismayed at their looks, though they be a rebellious house. Job mocketh at fear and is not affrighted, neither turneth. These are all the rejoiceth and stuff. I figured I'd use the King James version of the quotes, which is what the currency they would have been using at the time. Little bit bloodthirsty here, another Job quote, she dwelleth and abideth on the rock. This one's one where the cover ties, the illustration ties in pretty literally with the verse. Christian Commission was a private organization. This is an envelope. It's like the return address on an envelope. They were concerned with the spiritual and physical well-being of Union troops. They worked hand in hand with the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which was another private organization that looked to the cleanliness of camps and provided nursing services. They held thousands of revival meetings, baptisms. Over the course of the war, provided over 1 million Bibles to Union troops. And in one thing I saw, 30 million broadsides. There should have been like one-page handout sheets. They also developed the coffee wagon, the movable coffee wagon, and provided coffee, fresh hot coffee to the soldiers. If you've ever been to Antietam and seen the monument to Commissary Sergeant William McKinley, the future president, he earned his monument by bravely serving coffee to all the soldiers during the battle. These two are from a tract society. This was organizations like Jehovah's Witnesses that provided Bibles. The one on the left is the only New Testament verse that I've found in any of my studying of covers. The one on the right leaves me kind of scratching my head. I'm wondering what message they were conveying with it, but interesting nonetheless. Obviously, as in all wars, both sides felt that God was on their side. The one, if God is with us, who shall stand against us? The other one, obviously a northern cover, slamming southern clergy for, preaching secession and, the southern cause. This poem, God for Our Native Land, appears on quite a number of covers, and it's a real, the land our fathers won by the strong heart and hand, keen axe and brand. Who doth our flag, this is not the verse that appears on the covers, but it's, I think, the concluding verse. Who doth our flag defy, we challenge as our foe. Who will not for it die, out from us he must go. So that's sort of taking a shot, I believe, both at Southerners and, draft dodgers, as it were. So let them understand who that dear flag disclaim, which won their fathers' fame, we brand with endless shame. God for our native land. Next topic is women. The Civil War was not a Rosie the Riveter war. This was not a war where women went by the thousands into factories as in World War II. There were, of course, already the factory girls, like so famously in Lowell, Massachusetts, and other places, but there was not an enormous influx of women due to the war, but they did play a crucial role supporting the war. Probably the biggest one many of them played was simply taking over the family farm when dad and maybe a couple of his sons went off to war. The family farm was a totally family operation. People had big families, partly because of infant mortality, but partly because they needed that workforce on the farm. And you can imagine, it's the same cattle, it's the same wheat, and if 3 of the labor forces left, that's a big job to carry on. Also, particularly early in the war, before they got organized, but really throughout, women on both sides made an enormous number of uniforms. That probably faded out to contract work eventually, but bandages would have been a constant for women to do right till the end of the war. And of course, nursing was the big one. Nursing really matured, almost was invented as a profession during the Civil War. It was not exclusively a women's job. There were male nurses, but as the war developed, the number of women grew, and it became, I believe, predominantly women's work. A lot of them were volunteers, volunteered through the Sanitary Commission. They were necessary. Like after Gettysburg, there were 15,000 wounded left behind. And both generals, they left only a skeleton force of their medical team here. They figured there's going to be another battle. We're going to need the doctors ourselves. So they only left a few doctors behind. It was basically up to, at first, literally the citizens of Gettysburg, and then as people poured in, the citizens of the North to take care of those 15,000 wounded. They obviously serve 2 purposes. One, of course, the home front sending a message to the boy, to the son, the husband, the brother, we're supporting you, we're on your side too. Also a way for soldiers to show their wide that they appreciated what they were doing. I like them. I only support both boys gone. I wonder if they would take me. Nursing, of course, was Dorothy Dix and Clara Barton were the 2 best known. Barton is credited. The Red Cross came out of the Civil War. Barton worked with the Sanitary Commission. Dorothy Dix actually made her arrangements directly with a general. She was actually, at least at first, employed by, I forget which general it was, a commander of one of the Union armies. Humor. There's a lot of humorous covers. This one I particularly like. It's sort of reminds me of the Willie and Joe cartoons from World War II. A little naughty, but not very. But, this officer saying, front face, eyes, why don't you turn your faces to the front? Some of them were sort of insults disguised as humor. A fireman Zouave putting out Secession, the United States Theater program. The accusations of drunkenness and gluttony were common, both sides. The only reason the other side fights is because they keep them drunk. But there was real humor too. Now this makes a reference to this modern, I assume it's Blondine. It shows JD as Jefferson Davis walking a tightrope across Niagara Falls with the US Capitol in the background and somebody about to chop the rope off. Charles Blondine was the first Niagara Falls tightrope walker. His first walk across the gorge was 1859. So this was fresh news. He kept adding more complications. He would redo it every few years. And once he would wheel a wheelbarrow, he would do it blindfolded. He would carry somebody on his shoulders. Once he actually stopped midway and cooked an egg and ate it. Artemus Ward, I mentioned Artemus Ward in one of my earlier talks. He's credited as being America's first stand-up comic. Lowbrow humor. He was kind of a, country bumpkin with horse sense. He was also Lincoln's favorite writer, which ties in Lincoln. Lincoln was famous for his really lowbrow sense of humor and telling people corny jokes. But I love the image that he's about to read. He's assembled the cabinet to read them the Emancipation Proclamation, and he starts the meeting off by reading Artemus Ward's latest article, High-Handed Outrage at Utica. Ward was a friend of Mark Twain's and was credited with helping launch his career. There are several Artemus Ward covers. They're a treat to try to read. I tried to read the other one, which I don't have. I tried to read and translate all the way through. They're really a treat to read. The misspellings, since EYE spoke SPOK 22, etc. Some religious humor. Two from Proverbs 26, one, whips for thieves, and that's John Floyd. I mentioned him. He's Buchanan's Secretary of War who was accused of stealing money from the Treasury, although he was exonerated. Bridles for asses, that's Jefferson Davis, and rods for fools, and that's compromisers. This clearly would have been printed probably even before the inauguration of Lincoln, very early in 1861, before the firing on Fort Sumter. Floyd and compromisers would have been front page news in, say, February 1861, but faded quickly. The other one, Proverbs 26, I read the whole thing, and it is just a long list of the stupid man something, and it's just trash talking about various undesirables. This is one I tried to figure out what the significance of the slothful man saith there is a lion in the way. I guess maybe it's a cry to, be brave and persevere. I don't know. Some of the humor is very lowbrow, like the secessionist movement. I like the one on the left. The portly man in tails is always John Bull. That's England. I don't know why, but the dude with the sash, that's all. I don't know why, but that's always Jefferson Davis in any envelope cover. So Davis is telling John Bull, catch him, ha ha ha, and is obviously about to pull a nasty trick on him by letting the seesaw go. I just got that one in the middle, and I'm trying to figure out if that's supposed to be John Burns, the famous civilian from 75-year-old civilian from Gettysburg who on July 1st, appropriately the first day of the battle, heard the musketry and went and grabbed his old flintlock and went and joined the Union Army and lived out the rest of his years on his celebrity from that. I haven't found any references to it, but the country's in danger. That's what's the matter. I think maybe that's supposed to be him. This I just figured out. This was a series. As I was putting this presentation together, I had several of these and had made the connection, but there's at least a 10-part series based on the old poem, The House That Jack Built. But you can see the malt that laid the foundation is the blessings we have enjoyed. It's very political. The dog that worried the cat is Jefferson Davis. The cow that will toss the dog is Winfield Scott. I've got 5 of the 10. I'm on the lookout for the other 5. Number 7, the maiden, all forlorn that raised the cow. And then number 9, I'm assuming that's George Washington, the parson, etc. It in that nursery rhyme, it builds up from the beginning. Each new verse has an additional verse added to the former verses. The Lincoln Comet, this was one that puzzled me when I first saw it, but it turns out there was a great comet in 1861. It was first spotted by astronomers right around the time of Fort Sumter, though it was not visible to the naked eye until summer, but people knew it was coming, and it was followed in the newspapers, both north and south, and widely was considered, again, north and south as a harbinger of war. So one enterprising printer decided to capitalize on the interest in the comet and Abe Lincoln. Racial attitudes. Now this is to me at least, I found the collection of covers on slavery to be interesting. Without going and doing any research on, I mean, generally, everybody knows that the attitudes toward even abolitionists might be anti-slavery, were not pro-freedmen. They just thought slavery was wrong. But as depicted by the covers, how I interpret the way the printers viewed public interest in the North, public opinion in the North. A background to understand contraband. Northern policy at first was don't interfere with local institutions. That means slavery. Lincoln's main concern was I got to keep Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and Missouri in the Union, and I don't want to alienate them. And a couple of Union commanders who declared the slaves free in their territory promptly got slapped down, and at least in the case of John C. Fremont, demoted as well. Ben Butler was commander at Fort Monroe. He was a trial lawyer. He was not much of a general, but a very clever guy. The night he arrived, 3 slaves made their way into Union lines. They had been working near the fort building fortifications, and he just figured out a way to finesse the issue. He didn't say anything about their status. He just declared them, he confiscated them as contraband of war, the way you would take a cannon. He sent that message off to Washington. Everybody assumed he's promptly get a message back from Washington saying, don't interfere with local institutions, send them back. The cabinet thought about it for a couple days, finally sent Butler a message saying, we remind you of the policy against interfering with local institutions, but if any slaves who have been working on fortifications against us make it to your lines, you are authorized to keep them and make whatever use of them you find appropriate. A real politician's way to keep a policy but finesse your way around it. And within seemingly seconds, the word had passed to every slave community, all the way as far as there were slave communities, and the flood was on. Thousands of slaves made their way to Union lines over the course of the war. Anyway, with that background, what I interpret from these covers about Northern public attitudes is there was great hostility to the institution, to the idea of slavery, fascination with this idea of slaves running away, contraband, one of the most fertile sources of covers of all topics. A very it's polite to say the attitude toward enslaved people was patronizing. Some of it from the 21st century we would just say was out and out racist. But they did show the slaves taking action to gain their freedom. They didn't portray sort of the passive, lethargic slave waiting for somebody to come free him. You know, by our standards, some of them are pretty blood curdling with that caveat. Clearly a view that it's a cruel institution. The Northern printers' attitudes toward John Bull was very mixed. Some of them were sort of trying to say, hey, John Bull, you're our friend, aren't you? And some of them portrayed him as a really callous guy who was only concerned with cotton. Two have to be considered sarcastic views. I assume this is kind of a, you know, a companion piece, point counterpoint. These are some of the contraband ones. You'll see the one on the top, the printing isn't the greatest, but that fort on the far right is labeled Fort Monroe. The guy, the overseer with the whip, come back here, you black rascal, can't come back. Massa, massa, this child's contraband. Contraband barricade, come and get your property. You know, they talk in real, you know, I don't know what the term is, but they have them talk in real sort of stereotyped language. The one is heading to Manassas Junction. Lots of, I mean, there's many that make reference to contraband. Really stereotyped drawings, of course. Massa gun to fight, I'll go to Washington. These show, you know, slaves taking matters into their own hands. That one on the left is one of the most complex envelope covers there is. Basically, the main point of it is that Virginia's going to be the battleground, which it was, but it shows Northern troops climbing the Old Dominion from the left side, Southern troops from the right side and fighting on top. There's a snake climbing up her walking stick, and then beneath her there's some slaves making their way from north to south. Others, you know, again, making their escape. These are really pretty blood curdling, but obviously they don't show, as I said, the sympathetic to, hostile to slavery, but not necessarily sympathetic to blacks. This one is really of its time. It shows, you know, obviously the old trusted, you know, butler, I guess, you know, served your father. I wouldn't pull that down. Pull that flag down. You'll never forgive yourself. Your father fought to defend the flag, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There was a whole series of covers. There must have been 10 of them. All of them, they had that, well, that one's number 10. All of them had that label, Movement of the Army from Washington to Richmond. I assume these probably would have been printed in early 1862, you know, before George McClellan's been whipped in the 7 days, when he's making such a big deal about movement on to Washington. Anyway, there's a whole series of these showing soldiers eating, marching, in camp, all sorts of things. And then there's this one, Movement of the Army from Washington to Richmond, you know, with the portrayal of, you know, the camp followers, which came, every Union army by the end of the war had these escaped slaves who just were sort of traveling with the army and doing cooking or whatever they could do. War weariness emerges as a real topic. I'm assuming toward the end of the run for the envelopes, mid to late 1862. The trend in the war, when the war started, the first 6 months, although on a political front things didn't go that well for the Confederacy, you know, they lost Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, and Western Virginia, but militarily, late 1861 was almost entirely victories for the South: Manassas, Ball's Bluff, Wilson's Creek. Early 1862, it looked like the tide had really turned. and there was a real losing streak. And the South was you read the papers in the South, and they're pretty despondent. I assume it would have been around then. There's a lot of this, The Girl I Left Behind. This one, I love this poem, The Soldier's Dream of Home. Our bugles ran truce, for the night cloud had lowered, and the sentinel stars set their watch in the sky. And thousands had sunk on the ground overpowered, the weary to sleep and the wounded to die. Now, that's a powerful line. And then he proceeds to tell the story. He had this dream that the bold italic are the lines that are actually printed on the envelope. My little ones kissed me 1,000 times over. My wife sobbed aloud in her fullness of heart. Stay, stay with us, blah, blah, blah. But sorrow returned with the dawn of morn, and the voice in my dreaming ear melted away. Here are two that really show people who are eager for the war to end. I mean, nothing could be more blunt than the one on the right. I have no hesitation in saying, and I say it boldly, this civil war is ruinous. The one on the left is a real, we're one country and I can't wait to be reunited again. It's a lengthy poem. And there's, of course, religious citations calling for, thus saith the Lord, ye shall not go up, nor fight against your brethren. Return every man to his own house, for this thing is done of me. And the themes of the sun shining on the Union, the one on the left, it has shone before on a United States, and it shall again by the eternal. By the eternal was the beginning of Andrew Jackson's famous toast. By the eternal, the Union must and shall be preserved. I mean, these are a little, first we win the war, but real urgings for peace. And ambiguous, another one that I'm still scratching my head, trying to figure it out. The original verse, the original chapter is a really bloodthirsty thing about a civil war in, sort of pre-David. I don't know if it was called Israel back in the days of the ancient pre-Israelite, but why is his chariot so long in covering? Why tarry the wheels of his chariots? I'm going to sort of interpret as a why is this going on so long kind of message. And that, I think, is the end of the slideshow.
Thank you, Leon, and you're receiving praise in both chat and from the audience. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I find, as with most Civil War buffs, the first thing most people study is the battles and the generals and the campaigns. And as your interest deepens, the politics, the diplomacy, is England going to support the South? Was there a way the South could have organized more effectively? Those become also of interest, but the home front never gets that much attention. And anyway, I found it an interesting exercise to go through, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
I have a comment.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
There was an old prayer that was supposedly originated in the Civil War. It says, "Now I lay me down to sleep in mud that's many fathoms deep. If I'm not here when you awake, just dig me out with an oyster rake."
That reminds me when I was watching Ken Burns' Civil War. I'd be doing something else, but when Shelby Foote came on, I'd put my book down and pay attention because I had figured he was going to say something good. And sort of as the Chattanooga, Atlanta stuff is coming along, some segment of the Union Army is in Tullahoma, and he quoted some soldier's letter home saying, "We're encamped in Tullahoma. The name comes from the Greek word tulla, which means mud. and the Greek word homa, which means more mud.
Yeah, I'm sure those guys were all ready to go home for sure.
Oh yeah, because even if they were in camp for the winter and not moving on the march, their quarters were really pretty crummy. And on the march, I mean, literally, the typical marching kit for a soldier, the rifle, I think 60 bullets, maybe 40, depending on how imminent battle was thought to be, your canteen, blanket, and then at least each soldier would carry half a tent, with the idea that at night you pair up with somebody else and quickly stitch the tent together and the two of you sleep in it. And that was their quarters on a good night. Many nights it was al fresco.
That's putting it nicely. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my wife and I, just this week, a book that she labored on for a decade that I got involved with right at the end just came out. It's about her father's experiences in World War II. And his trove of 500 letters he wrote his fiance while he was in the army still survives. So the book is heavily based on his letters. And the two biggest preoccupations of soldiers was receiving mail and where they slept last night. You know, I mean, if they were in a building, that was worthy of a paragraph in the letter. So the Civil War soldiers rarely had that ability.
Well, speaking about that, how would they get the mail? You know, can you talk about that?
I know how it worked in World War II, and Thomas put his hand up. He may know something.
Tom.
When Dickinson College has a big thing on that in their library of the movement of mail. When they brought the wounded back from a battle, the mail went to wounded. But they never knew where the troops were. So the mail was always behind them. So, you know, that's about all I know is the soldiers' mail went to the hospital.
I assume the Civil War would have been a somewhat less developed version of what they did in World War II.
Yeah.
I did an appendix for the book on mail. All the mail would go to, I believe, all the mail to Europe. I think the Pacific probably had an office in San. It would go to one central post office in New York City and get post office, which gets sorted there and then be turned over to the Army. And they literally had thousands of APOs, Army post offices, throughout Europe. And it was just a matter of, you know, sort of going through a decision tree. The soldiers in the 11th Corps, he's in the 3rd Division, he's in the 2nd Brigade, you know, they're in, you know, Sperryville, Virginia, and just sorting it down the tree till it gets to the soldier. And then when it gets to his unit, if he's prisoner, if he's in a hospital, then it would get forwarded on. But a massive effort, but widely recognized as essential to morale. I was at a Civil War conference last fall, and a number of the books that people were making presentations about were based on soldier letters. There's apparently, you know, tens of thousands of them, even from the Civil War, that still exist. You know, it was largely a literate country.
Largely illiterate or illiterate?
Yeah, high literacy rate.
Okay.
Most people could read and write by then. And even the Army of the Potomac, I mean, they'd fight a battle every 2-3 months. But most of the war, you're in camp. You know, they fought in 1863, they fought Fredericksburg around Christmas time. They fought Chancellorsville in April, if I'm not mistaken. And then they fought, and they were on the march for about a month. June and July was consumed with the Gettysburg campaign. But much of the year they'd be in camp and have lots of leisure to play baseball and get in trouble and gamble and write letters home.
Had covers previously been used like this for propaganda or, as
They
for transmitting
apparently,
culture?
just barely. They apparently emerged, I don't know if it was 1856 or 1852 in a previous presidential campaign.
Yeah, mostly political.
Mostly
Yeah,
political.
they were political.
I've never seen
There
any
were-
samples covers with those.
Yeah, I've seen a few Fremont covers from 1856. I mean, I'm not seen in my hand. Seen them for sale on eBay. The price, of course, unsurprisingly, is out of sight. Also saw several Lincoln Hamlin covers. Hamlin was his vice president in 1860. They're also, at least for my price range, they're out of sight too. $500 or so.
Mm.
Yeah, a little ridiculous.
And
Yeah.
the covers were great, were ideal because they were passing hands. They had a lot of eyes on them. I mean, why covers?
Well, I think, a lot of them were bought as collectibles, like this scrapbook that my cousin loaned me, that No Greater Calamity was the backbone for that book. Hiram Russa bought them and stuck them in a scrapbook. He had a collection of 300 of them that were straight from the printer into his scrapbook.
Wow.
And I think that wasn't uncommon. Why would people buy them? To mail them? I think just because, I think the main message is to the recipient. Go team go, like you buy a cover of George McClellan back when he was still a hero. And you say, oh yeah, George McClellan, he's great. He's your general. I'm following the news. I know what's up. Obviously the printers were smart about, like Elmer Ellsworth, who I mentioned, I think last presentation, I lose track. He was the first martyr.
Right, at the hotel.
There are probably 50 covers on the theme of Remember Ellsworth. There was a regiment raised. Its name was Ellsworth Avengers. Yeah, I think it was just, there's these stupid memes that circulate on Facebook. I think in a way they're the 19th century equivalent.
There you go. Memes of
Jefferson
the Civil
Davis
War.
belongs in a noose. George McClellan, the liberator of Western Virginia. George McClellan's promise, we have beat our last retreat. That was sure a promise that was perishable.
That was perishable.
George
Hey,
McClellan.
what you have to remember is these patriotic covers, like he said, went in the scrapbooks, were postcards. They didn't have postcards back then.
Oh yeah,
Pre-postcards. Yeah.
that's right.
Pre-postcards.
So it wasn't
So
an
that-
actual envelope. It was a postcard.
No, they were in the
No.
form of. It just means functionally they serve the purpose of a postcard.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because they didn't have a picture postcard to write in the back, so that was their postcard, basically writing on the envelope.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, most of the ones for sale on eBay are unused. There's a lot
Right.
that are used, but I'd say the majority are unused. So
I
clearly the
How many of them
collector.
are fake?
Hmm?
I kind of wonder how many of them on eBay are fake, though.
I have a few, not a huge number. I've not ever had my hands on one that made me suspicious. I'm not going to claim I'm an informed collector. There have to be some, though, obviously. There was one guy I saw, he was truth in labeling, but it was easy to zip by it. I'm sure it said photograph, and then in the fine print it said high quality photograph of a cover, but you were getting a photograph, not a cover, and he stopped appearing, so I suspect somebody shut him down.
And I have to plug, since we're being sponsored by the Apex,
Apex.
want to certify that that is an actual Civil War cover, send
I'm
it
not
here.
sure Apex would do that though.
Yeah, that would be a specialized brand of expertise.
You'd have to find out about that, Heidi, before you
Well,
start.
Gary has like 200 people at his service, at his, at his cadre.
That's impressive.
And I'm just reiterating, friends, that you can find Leon Reed's book on Amazon, No Greater Calamity for the Country.
That's a quote from Robert E. Lee, by the way.
Oh.
Yeah, I start the book with 4 quotes juxtaposed, giving the person's position at the time, like it's Robert E. Lee, Colonel, U.S. Army. But basically, his quote is like, I mean, it goes on with flowery words, but the operative part is, I can anticipate no greater calamity for the country than for it to be dissolved. And the others were similar. Confederate guy saying the same thing about secession, and 2 Union people expressing sympathy for the South. And my point is how opinion changed so rapidly. People, Southerners who were ardent foes of secession, but wound up, many of them some of them after the election of Lincoln, some of them after Fort Sumter and Lincoln's call for troops, switching and saying, no, it's time to go. And Northerners who had a very sympathetic attitude toward the South, but then eventually switched to militant opposition. Butler himself, he was actually very sympathetic to the South. He was a Breckinridge delegate to the Democratic Convention, but secession, he said they have a good cause, they should fight for their rights, but they ought to do it politically. Secession is a bridge too far for me. Sickles also, Dan Sickles, the notorious rogue of Gettysburg, he was also until secession until Fort Sumter, actually, a very pro-Southern New York politician.
Yeah, it was quite a different time back then. I mean, when Eli Whitney came out with the cotton gin, it made cotton such a demandable product, in such high demand that for the first time in their lives, the Southern plantations were actually beginning to see a profit.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The tobacco industry had just about played out. You saw around the turn of the 19th century, you see a lot of Virginia planters manumitting their slaves, at least in their will, turning them free. And, partly that was a sense that it's a bad institution, but a lot of it was just, the asset is the whole plantation economy in Virginia was very based on tobacco, was dying away. You ate up the land so fast, it wasn't a sustainable business.
Yeah,
but then when cotton came along, the combined invention of the cotton gin, which mechanized cleaning the cotton, and the mechanical loom, which mechanized making a fabric of it, it went from being extremely expensive to just being dirt cheap. And suddenly there was a limitless demand for cotton.
Yeah. So they created their own problem there. But what can you say? That's economy for you, and money does strange things to people. But when all these dirt poor farmers in the South, just had nothing at all anyway.
And all
And
those dirt poor
all of a sudden
bankers,
they're rich.
all those dirt poor bankers in New York City too, made a lot of them rich.
Yeah.
The mills.
Yep. Yeah, it really was. It was the basis of the economy. The New York stock market after the election of Lincoln, there was a severe plunge in values because, the assumption was this is going to wreck the economy. Turned out to be half right. Wrecked the Southern economy. Northern economy prospered during the Civil War. It was an example of was truly an example of a guns and butter. LBJ always talked about guns and butter in Vietnam. We can fight Vietnam, but we can still have the war on poverty and stuff like that. He was wrong. In the Civil War, I mean, the non-war economy really grew rapidly.
How many people do you find, because you are involved with, Civil War and you attend these conferences, do you find that more and more Civil War buffs or even Civil War historians are incorporating postal history into their research?
No, I think it's very rare. I think it's. I think they should. I think I've discovered something of significance that newspapers have become a big thing, and letters. People looking for the common perspective, public opinion.
Mm-hmm.
So if you read a history now, you'll get a lot of quotes from newspapers and soldier diaries and stuff like that. I do think that the postal covers are another historical insight that are not being widely used by people.
Except philatelists.
Yeah, no, I mean by historians. Yeah. Bill Frazanito, he's another Gettysburg resident. He was a student at Gettysburg College, and he just went off and tromped around the battle. This is 50 years ago, in the 70s. And he wrote a book of, I forget what, A Journey in Time, I think it's called, where he took all these photographs and he went and identified where they were taken on the battlefield because of this rock with this shape, which is still there and stuff like that. And he made the point, now a truism, that photographs are historic documents. They're not just illustrations for your book. They have context, they have time, they have place. And that is now widely understood among Civil War scholars. And I think envelopes maybe don't belong in the same prominent place as photographs. For one thing, there aren't as many of them. But I think they do deserve a place in Civil War history.
I think the contents of the envelope sometimes should be preserved as well, and should be in some type of repository that's available for everybody.
Yeah, I've noticed, if you Google the title of an envelope, you'll often get a reference to like the New York Public Library collection or the Yale University. There are places that have, I guess, fairly extensive collections of them.
But they're not making them available.
Probably
they
not.
really need to.
Yeah.
And that's something I probably want to talk to Scott Tiffany about. I think there's a big demand possibly for a database of scanned enclosures of covers, especially historical type covers, like from the Civil War or such.
Yeah, I agree, because
be a great reference.
Yeah, because I can say, based on my own experience, there's more covers about Ellsworth than any other topic. But what I'm saying is, I've seen more covers of Ellsworth than any other topic. It would be useful to be able to actually say that there were 73 covers about Ellsworth, and the next most popular topic was George McClellan, and there were only 36 of that. I mean, that would be of significance to have a real comprehensive database.
Well, leave it to Philatelists to push the envelope forward. And with that, we have come to the end of our APS Stamp Chat. Thank you, Mr. Reed, for being our guest. And thanks, friends, for joining us and for watching. If you're looking to learn more about items from your collection, if you want to learn more about their history, their authenticity, the APS Expertising Department is your go-to resource. Begin this process by downloading a certificate application form from stamps.org. And remember, APS members receive a discount on this service. So if you're not a member, join us now on stamps.org. Give Apex a try. You will not be disappointed. On that note, thank you, Mr. Reed, for being our guest. And thank you, members and friends, for attending Stamp Chat. See you next time.
Great conversation.